Deep in the Peruvian Amazon, on a humid afternoon in 2011, a young geothermal scientist named Andres Russo waded up to a narrow bend in the jungle where the ground itself seemed to be exhaling steam. He had grown up in Lima, hearing his grandfather's stories about a river hot enough to cook a man alive, and every geologist he had ever asked, from Peru to Houston to Southern Methodist University, had told him the same thing. It was a legend. It could not exist. The nearest active volcano lay more than 400 miles away. There was no known mechanism on Earth capable of heating that much moving water in the middle of the Amazon basin. And yet, when he finally reached the bank of the Shanay Timpishka, he watched a small animal fall into the current and die within seconds, its eyes clouding to a milky white before its body sank out of sight. When he lowered a thermometer into the water, the reading climbed past 91 degrees Celsius, close to boiling, and it did not fall. Nearly 200 degrees Fahrenheit, moving downstream at the speed of a normal jungle river. In that moment, standing beside a river that, by every rule he had ever learned, should not exist, he understood something that would later fill a peer-reviewed paper and a book about the limits of geology. The map of the impossible is smaller than we think. This video is about 10 places on Earth that live outside that map. Places where an entire river splits in two, and half of it disappears into a hole that leads nowhere anyone can find. Places where lightning strikes the same patch of sky for about 260 nights a year, so consistent that sailors once used it as a navigation beacon. Places where a whole ecosystem has evolved in total darkness, sealed off from the surface for more than 5 million years, breathing air that would kill a human in minutes. Places so radioactive that standing at the shoreline for 1 hour is a death sentence, and where single Soviet accidents spread contamination across an area larger than most European countries. Places where entire villages fall asleep on the sidewalk, on the school steps, in the middle of a conversation, and no doctor in the country can explain why. For decades, these locations have been studied, drilled, sampled, photographed from orbit, and probed with dye packets, ping-pong balls, sound recorders, and radiation counters. In many of them, the mystery still refuses to break open. Some are natural laboratories older than any human civilization. Some are the direct fingerprint of Cold War industry. All of them share one property. When you stand in front of them, you feel the quiet unease of a planet that has not finished revealing itself. The central question of this video is not just how these places formed, is what it means that even now, in an era of orbital sensors, DNA sequencing, and machine learning applied to geology, we still cannot fully explain them. Are they gaps in our science or gaps in the science of the Earth itself? To answer that, we will travel from the Peruvian rainforest to a valley in central Norway where the sky has been lit up by unknown lights since at least the 1930s, from a cave sealed away beneath Romania to a lake in the Ural Mountains so contaminated that engineers eventually poured concrete over it to keep the wind from spreading its dust. We will visit a Kazakh town whose people fell asleep by the hundreds, a Namibian desert patterned with circles that no biologist has fully explained, and an Italian hillside where a cherry tree grows on top of a mulberry tree, both of them alive and full-grown. Everything in this video is drawn from documented research, published field observations, newspaper archives, and the accounts of scientists who actually stood in these places. Where a mystery has since been partially explained, as with the sinkhole of Devil's Kettle in Minnesota, cracked open by a pair of hydrologists in 2017, or the sleeping sickness of Kalachi in Kazakhstan, traced back years later to something buried in the ground nearby, we will tell you exactly what was found. Where the mystery still stands, we will say that too. If you find yourself as unsettled as those researchers were, do us one small favor. Hit the like button and subscribe, because this channel exists to chase exactly these kind of questions, and every click helps us go further. Now, before we return to the boiling river at the end of the story, we begin with a much colder mystery, in a pine forest in the far north of the United States, where an entire river simply falls into the ground and vanishes. The mystery lives in a state park in northeastern Minnesota, in a stretch of pine and birch forest not far from the north shore of Lake Superior. The Brule River runs through Judge C, or Magny State Park, in a rush of dark, cold water, cutting narrow gorges through basalt bedrock left behind by ancient lava flows. About 1.5 miles up the trail from the parking lot, the river reaches a jagged outcropping of rock and does something strange. It splits in two. The eastern branch tumbles down a normal waterfall into a pool and continues on toward the lake, exactly as any river should. The western branch drops straight down into a black cylindrical hole in the rock, a giant pothole about 10 feet across, and disappears. That hole is called the Devil's Kettle. And for most of the 20th century, no one who studied it could tell you where the water went. The problem was not just curiosity. It was physics. Rivers do not simply lose half their volume into the ground. Every drop that goes over that lip has to end up somewhere, whether that means surfacing downstream, feeding a spring, or filling an underground reservoir. So geologists tried the obvious tests. Beginning in the mid-20th century, they poured colored dye into the kettle and waited by the lake to see if anything came up. Nothing did. They tried tracer chemicals. Nothing. They dropped ping-pong balls, then logs, then, according to local lore, an entire tree spray painted bright orange. None of it ever came out. Rangers at the park spent years fielding tourist theories. Maybe the water tunneled under the lake. Maybe it hit a fault line and traveled hundreds of miles. Maybe it fed some hidden underground river system that no map had ever recorded. The mystery became a fixture of Minnesota folklore and, eventually, of the kind of internet listicle that promises to show you the strangest places on Earth. Then, in 2017, a pair of hydrologists connected to the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources and the University of Minnesota, veterans of decades of karst and groundwater studies across the region, decided to try something the mystery hunters had somehow skipped. They simply measured the flow of the river, above the falls and below them, at low water conditions in the fall. They set up gauging equipment above the falls and again a short distance downstream of where the western branch disappears, and they compared the volumes. The numbers came back almost identical. Roughly the same amount of water flowing in above the falls, roughly the same amount flowing out below them. In other words, no water was actually being lost. The two branches were rejoining almost immediately underneath the churning pool at the base of the kettle, and continuing on together. The reason nothing ever came out visibly was much less exotic than a portal to a parallel universe. The plunge pool below the kettle is a violent, high-pressure blender of water and rock. Anything solid dropped into it, dye particles included, gets pulverized, diluted, and pushed downstream in a form nobody standing on the shoreline could easily spot. The result was scheduled for follow-up testing with actual dye tracers in the years after, and later trials appeared to confirm the same basic conclusion. Water in, water out, no missing river. But something about the Devil's Kettle refuses to lose its aura, and that is worth thinking about. The mystery lasted for decades not because the physics was truly impossible, but because nobody with the right instruments and the right question walked up to it soon enough. That is going to be a recurring theme in this video. Many of the places we are about to visit are not proof of alien science. They are proof that Earth's surface still contains blind spots, sometimes stunningly obvious ones, that only fall away when a scientist finally shows up with the right hardware. Others, though, have refused to yield even when the hardware arrived, when the funding arrived, when the university teams arrived with radio telescopes and spectrometers. To find one of those, we now travel across the Atlantic to a quiet rural valley in central Norway, where the lights in the sky have been doing something no atmospheric physicist has fully explained since well before the Second World War. There's no plunge pool this time to hide the answer, no cracked river to blame. Just farmland forest, and a nightly display that keeps showing up on camera and refuses to make sense. Hessdalen is a valley about 120 kilometers south of Trondheim, in central Norway. It is a small place, a few hundred residents, spread out across farms and hamlets tucked into a broad basin ringed by low mountains. The kind of Nordic countryside that on a clear winter night is almost aggressively dark, without streetlights, without traffic, without the ambient glow of any nearby city. And it is precisely on those quiet nights that the sky in Hessdalen does something the residents cannot get used to. Since at least the 1930s, according to local records collected later, people in the valley have reported strange lights hanging in the air over the mountains and the river. Sometimes they are small, the size of a car headlight. Sometimes they are the size of a house. They come in various colors, most often white and yellow, sometimes red or blue. Some hover for up to an hour. Others streak across the valley at high speed. Some pulse. Some seem to change shape. Some appear low over the ground, following the terrain like they are being guided by it. And they do this again and again, most heavily during a period in the early 1980s when residents began reporting sightings almost nightly. That was the point at which the Hessdalen phenomenon left folklore and became a scientific problem. In 1983, a team of Norwegian researchers working under the name Project Hessdalen, and led in part by the engineer Erling Strand, arrived in the valley with cameras, radios, magnetometers, and spectrum analyzers. They did not want folklore. They wanted measurements. Over the course of that first winter, they recorded lights on film, tracked them with radar, and picked up unusual magnetic and radio signatures. In 1998, they installed a permanent automatic measurement station in the valley, along with high-resolution cameras and instruments capable of running unattended, so that the phenomenon could be observed even without a human standing there waiting. The Italian astrophysicist Massimo Teodorini later joined the effort, contributing spectroscopic analysis that suggested what the cameras were catching was some kind of ionized gas, glowing plasma, releasing energy on the order of a small kitchen appliance running full blast, but somehow sustained in mid-air for far longer than any known plasma should hold together. That last point is what makes Hessdalen resistant to easy explanations. Ionized gas in the atmosphere is well understood. It shows up in lightning, in the aurora borealis, in ball lightning during storms. But those events are short-lived, measured in fractions of a second or, at most, a few seconds. The Hessdalen lights sometimes persist for many minutes. Theories to explain them have piled up over the decades, and one by one have been questioned. One hypothesis suggested that radon dust rising from the ground and decaying in the air could produce a glow, but the isotope signatures never quite lined up. Another proposed that the valley floor contains veins of sulfur that could react with river water to throw off sparks. A more recent proposal, coming out of Coulomb crystallization studies, imagines microscopic charged dust particles that lock into ordered structures capable of confining a plasma bubble, but the evidence remains fragmentary. None of these explanations has closed the case. What is beyond dispute is that the lights are real, that they have been photographed and instrumented from multiple angles over more than 40 years, and that they show up more often in some places along the valley than others, hinting at a geological source that no team has yet fully pinned down. Reports have decreased in the last decade or so, which only makes the mystery harder, since the phenomenon may be quieting down before anyone gets to conclusively film it under controlled conditions with the full modern toolkit of high-speed cameras, drone-based spectrometers, and continuous ground-based monitoring. The scientists who spent their careers on it are now watching the clock, aware that if the lights stop entirely, the answer may go with them. Before we leave Norway, take a second and hit like on this video because it genuinely helps this channel investigate cases like Hessdalen that mainstream science has quietly set aside. Because if the sky above a farming village can burn for 4 decades without a settled explanation, imagine what a cave sealed off from that same sky for 5 million years might be hiding. That is where we go next, and it is arguably the strangest place on this list. In 1986, in the flat farming country near the Black Sea coast of southeastern Romania, a crew of workers was drilling test cores into the earth. The Ceausescu government wanted to know whether the ground near the town of Mangalia was stable enough to support a new power plant. One of those cores punched through a thin layer of rock and hit empty space. The workers had no idea what they had found. What they had done was crack open a natural chamber that had been completely sealed off from the surface of the Earth for something on the order of 5.5 million years. The site is now known as Movile Cave. It is small, only a couple of 100 meters of tunnels, and one central chamber holding a lake of sulfuric groundwater. But those numbers do not tell you what it feels like to be inside. The air in Movile is not the air we breathe. Oxygen is drastically lower, closer to half the concentration of a normal atmosphere. Hydrogen sulfide, the gas that gives rotting eggs their smell, is high enough to be toxic to a human within minutes of exposure. Carbon dioxide is roughly 100 times more concentrated than at the surface. The lake at the center of the chamber is warm and reeks like old sewers. Everything about Movile is designed, if that word applies, to kill anything that evolved above ground. And that is what makes the second half of the story impossible to look away from. Because things live down there. A lot of things. When the Romanian biologist Serban Sarbu descended into the cave in the early 1990s, wearing full breathing gear and dropping down a narrow shaft on a rope into a darkness that had never once been touched by a beam of sunlight, he found an entire ecosystem that had been running on its own, cut off from the surface world for millions of years, with its own food chain, its own predators, its own quiet balance. So far, researchers have cataloged around 48 species inside the cave, of which roughly 33 are endemic, meaning they exist nowhere else on Earth. There are cave leeches, pseudoscorpions, water scorpions, cave spiders, isopods, and a variety of specialized worms and snails. They are pale, often blind, evolved in a way that would look correct only in a very dark science fiction film. But the truly startling finding was not the animals themselves. It was what feeds them. On the surface of that lake, and on the walls just above it, is a thin, gelatinous mat, a kind of foam. That mat is a colony of bacteria and archaea that have learned to make a living not from sunlight, like every plant we know, but from chemistry. They oxidize hydrogen sulfide and methane, pulling energy out of the poisonous water and the poisonous air, and building the sugars and proteins that the rest of the ecosystem depends on. Everything else in Movile, every leech and every spider, ultimately eats that mat, or eats something that ate that mat, is one of the very few complete ecosystems on Earth that runs entirely on chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis, sunlight replaced by the slow disintegration of sulfur compounds in a lightless room. That fact rewrote a chapter in what biologists thought life required. If a full food chain can sustain itself for millions of years without ever seeing the sun, breathing air that would suffocate us, then the definition of a habitable environment suddenly becomes much wider. NASA, in particular, has taken serious interest because Movile is one of the closest analogs on Earth to conditions researchers imagine under the ice of Europa or Enceladus, or in the ancient subsurface of Mars. Access to the cave is now tightly controlled. Only a small number of scientists are allowed in each year. They have to quarantine on the way down and on the way back up, both to protect themselves from the atmosphere and to keep from carrying anything foreign into a system that has been undisturbed for longer than any human species has existed. Movile is what happens when Earth quietly runs an experiment for 5 million years and no one is watching. Our next location is what happens when Earth's own systems get shoved aside by roughly 40 years of Soviet nuclear industry. If a cave sealed off from the sun for 5 million years is the strangest natural laboratory on this list, the next place is the strangest man, made one, born from a completely different kind of secrecy, and it might also be the deadliest body of water on the surface of the planet. In the southern Ural Mountains of Russia, near the closed city, once known as Chelyabinsk, 40, and today called Ozyorsk, there's a shallow depression in the landscape that used to be a small lake. Its name is Karachay. On any modern map it barely registers, a smudge of green surrounded by industrial buildings. But for several decades of the 20th century, Lake Karachay was arguably the most radioactive body of water anywhere on the surface of the Earth. The lake sits on the grounds of the Mayak Production Association, a Soviet nuclear complex built in the late 1940s to produce plutonium for the country's first atomic bombs. From the early 1950s onward, engineers at Mayak used the lake as an open-air dump for high-level radioactive waste. Liquid effluent from reprocessing, coolant water contaminated with cesium-137 and strontium-90, and other byproducts of weapons-grade nuclear work were piped directly into the water. Over the years, the accumulated radioactivity in the lake reached levels that read almost like a physics textbook error. Estimates place the total activity dumped there at around 4 exabecquerels, a number of the same order of magnitude as the total release from Chernobyl. Except at Chernobyl, most of that energy exploded outward into the atmosphere over Ukraine and Belarus. At Karachay, it stayed put, concentrated in a body of water you could theoretically walk to. The consequences of that concentration were catastrophic. Standing on the shoreline of Karachay in its worst years was estimated to deliver a radiation dose of hundreds of roentgens per hour, high enough that an unshielded human being would receive a lethal exposure in about an hour, sometimes less. Not radiation sickness. Not a raised risk of cancer years down the line. A dose consistent with acute, unrecoverable damage from single visit. Even the sediment on the lake bed was so contaminated that any disturbance risked lofting radioactive dust into the wind. And that is exactly what happened in the spring of 1967. A prolonged drought lowered the water level dramatically and exposed the dry radioactive bed of the lake. A powerful windstorm then picked up the dust and carried it across an area estimated at around 2,700 square kilometers, contaminating farmland, villages, and forests inhabited by hundreds of thousands of people. A silent, invisible Chernobyl delivered years before the world had ever heard the name Chernobyl. That episode was not the worst thing that had happened at Mayak. 10 years earlier, in 1957, a separate storage tank of high-level waste at the same facility overheated and exploded in what became known as the KYSHTYM disaster, releasing a radioactive plume that spread more than 300 kilometers to the northeast. The Soviet government kept the accident classified for decades. Only in the late 1980s, in the era of glasnost, did the true scale of Mayak's contamination begin to reach the outside world. When it did, the picture that emerged was of an entire region, its rivers, its lakes, its groundwater, and its topsoil, saturated with fission products from the very first years of the arms race. Karachay itself, meanwhile, had become such an obvious threat that the Soviet response was almost primitive in its bluntness. There was no clean-up in the modern sense, no filtration, no removal of the sediment to a proper repository. Starting in the late 1970s, engineers began dumping large concrete blocks and rock filled directly into the lake, tens of thousands of tons of them over the years, in a decades-long project to entomb the radioactive mud and stop it from ever going airborne again. That work continued into the 2010s. Today the lake is essentially gone, replaced by a concrete and rock cap that pins the radioactivity to the ground. And yet the surrounding area remains sensitive, monitored, and in places, still off-limits. Karachay is a reminder that the strangest, most impossible places on Earth are not always ancient natural mysteries. Some of them are the fingerprints of one century of choices, made in a hurry, behind closed doors. The next place on our list combines both categories at once. A modern town, mostly Kazakh, with an old Soviet mine underneath it, and a mystery epidemic that put hundreds of people to sleep on the sidewalk, in the middle of the street, and in the middle of ordinary daily errands, for reasons that took the country's scientists years to reconstruct. The village of Kalachi sits on a wide steppe in the Akmola region of northern Kazakhstan, several hours' drive from the capital. It is a small place, a few hundred residents, mostly ethnic Kazakhs and Russians, living in one-story houses spread out along dusty streets. There is a school, a shop, a clinic, and the empty shell of a Soviet-era uranium mining complex on a rise just outside town. For most of its history, Kalachi was unremarkable, the kind of village that shows up on a regional map and nowhere else. Then, around 2010, its residents started falling asleep. It began quietly. A woman on her way home from the market would sit down on a bench and lose consciousness for hours. A schoolboy would put his head on his desk in the middle of a lesson and not wake up until the next morning. A tractor driver was found slumped over the wheel of his idling machine in a field. Doctors at first assumed alcohol or fatigue, but the pattern was too consistent and too strange to write off. When patients finally came to, they often had no memory of the last day or two, and many of them described vivid hallucinations, a feeling of walls closing in, or of animals crawling on the ceiling. Some slept for 2 days at a stretch, then woke up in a hospital bed unable to say what had happened. The village doctor started calling it, simply, the sleeping sickness. Between 2010 and 2015, more than 100 residents were affected, some of them repeatedly. The Kazakh government sent in medical teams, ran blood tests, took soil samples, tested the water, and quietly began the process of relocating families out of the village. The obvious first suspect was radiation. The abandoned uranium mine on the edge of town had been closed since the Soviet era and left unfilled, and it seemed logical that some kind of radioactive gas or leaching contaminant was the cause. But the tests kept coming back wrong. Residents' blood chemistry did not match anything like radiation poisoning. Radiation levels in the air and the water were within normal limits. A neighboring village, physically closer to the mine, reported no such epidemic. Whatever was happening in Kalachi was clearly linked to the mine somehow, but not through radioactivity. Investigators ran through the obvious candidates one by one. Heavy metal poisoning from the mine tailings. Some kind of bacterial or viral infection. A neurological condition triggered by a specific chemical in the water supply. Even at one point, seasonal weather patterns interacting with the local geology. None of it lined up with the actual case notes, which showed people collapsing in different seasons, at different ages, indoors and outdoors, with no consistent trigger anyone could isolate. The answer, when it finally came, was almost embarrassingly simple, and it took a team of Russian scientists working on the site to piece it together. The old mine shafts, after decades of abandonment, had partially flooded and collapsed. Underground water was displacing air out of the tunnels. That air, chemically stale from years of decay and rock oxidation, was heavy in carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide and correspondingly depleted in oxygen. On certain days, when atmospheric pressure dropped and wind conditions were right, this dead air was being pushed out of the mine and drifting down over the village. Residents were quite literally being gassed in their own homes and on their own streets by an invisible plume of low oxygen, high carbon monoxide air seeping from the abandoned workings. That is why blood tests looked wrong for radiation, because the true agent was atmospheric. Once the mechanism was understood, the response was blunt. Most of the remaining residents were relocated over the next few years, and the village was largely emptied out. The mystery of the sleeping sickness of Kalachi did not turn out to be an alien signal or an unknown pathogen. It turned out to be an old industrial site quietly poisoning the town it was supposed to have finished with decades earlier. A slow, silent aftershock of Soviet mining, the same era that gave us Lake Karachay. And in that sense, our next place is a kind of relief. Because after 2 chapters of human-made mystery, we are heading to a desert in southern Africa where the strangeness is entirely, stubbornly natural, visible from an airplane window, and where the mystery comes in the shape of thousands upon thousands of circles. From an airplane window over the Namib Desert in southern Africa, the landscape does something that looks almost like graphic design. Stretched across hundreds of kilometers of arid grassland, running from Angola down through Namibia and into South Africa, the ground is covered in circles. Round patches of bare red soil, each one framed by a ring of taller grass, spaced out at strikingly regular intervals across an otherwise featureless plain. Some circles are the size of a dinner plate. Others reach 10 meters across, occasionally more. From above, they look manufactured, like the imprint of some enormous grid stamped into the sand. On the ground, they look like the small clearings you expect to find around long-dead campfires. But nothing has been camped there. Nothing has been built. The circles have simply been there in one form or another for as long as anyone has recorded them, appearing, aging, and disappearing on a slow cycle of decades. Explaining them has become a small industry in ecology. For years, the leading hypothesis, championed by the German biologist Norbert Jürgens, was that the circles were the work of sand termites, which eat the grass roots underneath and produce the bare patch as a byproduct of a strategy for capturing rainfall. Field studies did find termites in many circles. But another camp, led by researchers including Walter Tschinkel and, more recently, the ecologist Stefan Getzen, has argued that termites are a symptom, not a cause. In their model, the circles form spontaneously through plant self-organization. Grass roots compete fiercely for the scarce desert water, and mathematics predicts that in a stressed ecosystem, vegetation can arrange itself into regular touring style patterns. Recent field measurements have leaned in that direction, showing that the bare patches act as small reservoirs of soil moisture that the ring of tall grass around them is quietly draining. But even now, no single explanation has won the field cleanly. The circles are one of the last unresolved puzzles in landscape ecology. Then there is a hillside in the Piedmont region of northwestern Italy, between the villages of Grena and Casorzo, where the mystery is much smaller in scale, but no less strange. Standing alone in a vineyard is what locals call the biobero, the double tree. It is a mulberry tree, several decades old, and growing directly out of the top of its trunk is a fully formed cherry tree, its branches fanning out 5 meters across, blossoming and fruiting in spring, like any healthy cherry. Trees growing on top of other trees is not unprecedented. Birds drop seeds, but those parasites almost always die young, unable to reach the soil below. The cherry of Casorzo, on the other hand, is estimated to be around 60 years old, thriving. Botanists believe its roots force their way down through the hollow interior of the mulberry, all the way to the ground, and are now drawing water and nutrients like a normal tree. Nobody has cut the mulberry open to confirm it because nobody wants to kill either tree to find out. And finally, on the high desert of northern New Mexico, in and around the town of Taos, a small percentage of the residents have spent the last 3 decades trying to convince the rest of the world that they are not imagining it. They call it the Taos hum. A low, persistent, mechanical droning sound, right at the edge of audibility, that they hear inside their homes in the middle of the night on quiet afternoons on the mesa. Estimates vary, but only somewhere between 2 and 11% of the population reports hearing it at all. In 1993, at the request of local residents, a congressional inquiry led acoustic engineers from major U.S. universities into Taos with microphones and spectrum analyzers. They found no consistent external source. Similar hums have since been documented in Bristol, in Windsor, Ontario, and in dozens of other towns worldwide. Some scientists suspect industrial infrasound from distant machinery or pipelines. Others suspect an unusual class of otoacoustic emissions inside the ear itself. But no theory yet explains why some people hear it so clearly, others do not hear it at all, and why the sound is so stubbornly local. 3 mysteries on 3 continents, none of them settled. And with that we come to the final chapter of this video, and to the 2 most cinematic locations on the list. A sky in Venezuela that has been on fire almost every night for centuries, and at last, a return to that boiling river in the Amazon, where the Catatumbo River empties into Lake Maracaibo in the far northwest of Venezuela. The sky does something that would be difficult to believe if it were not visible from space. Almost every night, for most of the year, a lightning storm ignites over the same patch of water and stays there. Not one bolt, not one storm cell that drifts away. A near-continuous flash of lightning, sometimes 10 hours at a stretch, for something on the order of 140 to 160 nights a year, by some counts many more. The strikes are so frequent that they saturate the horizon in a strobe of white and blue, so bright that sailors in the Caribbean have used the storm for centuries as a natural lighthouse. They called it the beacon of Maracaibo, the Pharaoh. You could correct your course by it. The reason the storm sits there is a matter of geography. Lake Maracaibo is a warm, humid basin ringed on three sides by the Andes. During the day, warm, moist air rises off the water and off the surrounding wetlands. At night, that air collides with cold winds sliding down off the mountains. The collision forces the moist air upward at high speed, feeding towering thunder cells that discharge over and over into the lake below. That much is basic meteorology. What makes Catatumbo unusual is not the mechanism, but the persistence. Other places in the world get thunderstorms. Only here do they station themselves in one geographic spot with such reliability that a Guinness record was created around it. For years, there was a popular theory that methane bubbling up from oil deposits in the surrounding wetlands was electrifying the storm chemically, making the lightning more intense. Later studies have questioned that idea, and the current view leans toward pure geography, water, and wind. But even that consensus has a footnote. In early 2010, during a prolonged drought linked to that year's El Nino, the lightning stopped completely for something on the order of 6 weeks. Nobody in living memory had ever recorded a pause like it. Fishermen in the region talked about it the way people would talk about the sun going out. When the rains returned, so did the storm, and the Pharaoh of Maracaibo went back to lighting up the sky as if nothing had happened. That silence is still not fully explained. Which brings us all the way back to the Amazon and to Andres Ruzo. The Shanai Timpishka, the boiling river, runs for a stretch of about 6 kilometers through the Peruvian rainforest near Pucallpa, in a valley considered sacred by the indigenous Ashaninka people. The section that Ruzo studied is roughly the width of a 2-lane road, and at its hottest points, hot enough to cause severe burns within seconds. He measured surface temperatures of up to about 86 degrees Celsius along much of the stretch, with pockets reaching close to boiling. Animals that fall in do die exactly the way the local stories describe, and the descriptions in the opening of this video are not exaggerated. What his research eventually showed is that the river is not volcanic in the ordinary sense. There's no magma chamber underneath it. The nearest active volcanism lies more than 700 kilometers away. Instead, the boiling river appears to be the surface expression of a deep hydrothermal system. Water heated at great depth, probably along ancient fault zones connected all the way back to the Andes, rises through cracks in the rock and emerges into the stream bed as scalding hot springs. Those springs collectively heat the entire river. It is a natural geothermal river operating in a place where geology said one should not exist. Ruzo's discovery did not conjure a new law of physics. It quietly redrew the map of where geothermal systems are possible on Earth. That, in the end, is what these 10 places have in common. Not that they break the laws of nature, but that they stretch our current understanding of where nature can operate. A river that boils without a volcano. A cave that hosts life without sunlight. A lake that kills without a bomb. A sky that burns for 4 decades over a Norwegian valley. Every one of them reminds us that this planet is still a working scientific problem, not a solved textbook. If you enjoyed this journey through the impossible, help the channel keep exploring it. Hit like, subscribe, and drop us a comment telling us which of these 10 places you would most or least want to visit in person. We read every one. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next investigation.